The first thing I heard wasn't the siren. It was laughter. Not nervous laughter, not awkward laughter. The kind that escaped someone before they could stop it. Deputy Ryan Mitchell stood beside his patrol SUV, with one hand resting on his duty belt, while trying, and failing, to keep a straight face. His shoulders shook as he stared at the bright red tractor parked beside my old hay barn. Across from him, HOA President Karen Whitmore looked absolutely furious. "No," she snapped, pointing an accusing finger at me. "This isn't funny. That tractor is illegal. It's not registered. It's destroying neighborhood property values. I want it impounded immediately." The deputy looked from Karen to the tractor, then back to Karen. "I'm sorry," he managed between chuckles. "Could you repeat that?" Karen folded her arms. "I reported an illegal agricultural vehicle operating inside the subdivision. It violates HOA regulations, county codes, and state transportation law." By then, half the neighborhood had gathered near the gravel entrance to my property. Some stood on their golf carts, others held coffee cups. A few had their phones raised, recording every second. I leaned against the tractor's massive rear tire, wiping grease from my hands with an old red shop rag. It had taken me 3 weekends to rebuild the transmission on my grandfather's 1972 International Harvester. I hadn't even driven it farther than my own pasture, yet somehow, Karen had convinced herself she'd uncovered a criminal operation. Deputy Mitchell slowly walked around the tractor, inspecting it with exaggerated seriousness. He crouched, checked the tires, tapped the steel hitch. Then he looked underneath before standing again. Karen smiled triumphantly. "I knew you'd find something." "Oh, I found something." "What?" The deputy pointed toward the faded metal emblem. "I found one of the cleanest vintage farm tractors I've seen in years." Several people laughed. Karen's smile vanished instantly. "That's irrelevant." "No, ma'am. It absolutely isn't." She took one step closer. "I demand you seize it." Deputy Mitchell blinked. "For what crime?" "It's illegal." "How?" "It doesn't have a license plate." Silence. Complete silence. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping. Then the deputy laughed again. "Ma'am?" He pointed toward the enormous tractor tires. "This thing isn't designed to drive down public highways, but it could. So could a riding lawnmower." Karen's face turned bright red. She spun toward me. "You manipulated him." "I haven't said 10 words. You've probably bribed the sheriff's office." The crowd erupted into murmurs. Deputy Mitchell's expression changed instantly. The smile disappeared. His posture stiffened. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said calmly, "be very careful with that accusation." Instead of backing down, she doubled down. "I know corruption when I see it." The deputy reached for the small notepad tucked into his vest. His voice became calm, professional, almost cold. "I'm documenting everything you've said." Karen looked around, expecting the neighbors to support her. Instead, nearly every phone in the crowd was now pointed directly at her. Someone whispered, "She's finally gone too far." I thought the morning couldn't get any stranger. I was wrong. A black county SUV rolled slowly through the entrance gate. No emergency lights, no siren, just a plain government vehicle covered in dust. The moment Deputy Mitchell saw it, his expression changed completely. He muttered under his breath, "Oh, you've got to be kidding me." The SUV stopped beside us. A man in a Navy county jacket stepped out, carrying a thick leather file, stamped with the county seal. He looked directly at me, then at Karen. Without introducing himself, he asked one question. "Which one of you authorized the complaint about protected agricultural land?" Every conversation stopped. Karen confidently stepped forward. "I did." The man slowly opened the file. His eyes narrowed. Then he quietly said something that made every person standing there, including the deputy, go completely silent. "I hope you have a very good attorney. Nobody wakes up expecting a 70-year-old farm tractor to become the center of a legal battle. If you'd asked me 6 months earlier what the biggest challenge in my life would be, I would have guessed replacing a section of split-rail fencing before winter, or figuring out why one of my irrigation lines kept losing pressure. I never would have imagined standing in front of deputies, neighbors, and county officials because an HOA president decided my family's history was somehow illegal. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 42 years old, and I own a small agricultural equipment restoration business just outside Bozeman, Montana. I spend my days bringing old tractors, combines, and farm equipment back to life for ranchers who'd rather preserve a piece of history than replace it with something new. To most people, they're rusty machines. To me, every dent, every faded decal and every worn gear tells a story. The property where all of this happened isn't just land on a map, it's home. My grandfather bought the original 40 acres in 1958 after returning from military service. He built the farmhouse himself, board by board, with help from neighbors who were paid in barbecue and cold lemonade instead of money. My father expanded the acreage over the years until it reached just under 60 acres. Every fence line, every cottonwood tree, and every weathered barn carried a memory from someone in my family. When my parents passed away within 3 years of each other, I inherited everything. Selling never crossed my mind. Some people inherit money. I inherited responsibility. Every morning started the same way. Coffee on the back porch before sunrise, a walk across the pasture to check the horses. Then I'd head into my workshop, where the smell of grease, diesel fuel, and fresh-cut oak had become as familiar as breathing. My closest neighbors were cattle ranchers who waved from their pickups and occasionally stopped by just to argue over whether an old John Deere engine was better than an international harvester. Life was quiet, predictable, exactly the way I liked it. That piece started changing when a new subdivision called Silver Ridge Estates appeared on the southern edge of my property. Within 18 months, what had once been open grazing land transformed into rows of expensive custom homes with decorative stone entrances, perfectly trimmed lawns, and a freshly formed homeowners association that seemed unusually interested in everything happening outside its own boundaries. At first, I didn't think much of it. People moved in. Kids rode bicycles. Families walked dogs along the sidewalks. Most were friendly enough. A few even brought their children over to see the horses or watch me restore antique tractors. I never charged anyone. If a kid wanted to climb into the driver's seat of a machine built before their grandparents were born, I'd happily let them. Watching their faces light up reminded me why I loved preserving these old machines in the first place. Then one Saturday morning, while I was repainting the hood of my grandfather's 1972 International Harvester, I noticed a woman standing at the fence separating my pasture from the subdivision. She wasn't admiring the view. She wasn't waving. She stood perfectly still, with a leather notebook tucked beneath one arm, studying my property as if she were inspecting a crime scene. When I walked over, she offered a tight smile that never reached her eyes. "Good morning," I said. She looked past me toward the tractor. "Do you own all of this?" "I do." She scribbled something in her notebook. "I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Silver Ridge Estates HOA. I nodded politely. "Nice to meet you." Instead of introducing herself further, she pointed toward my equipment shed. "Those old machines are visible from several homes. They're tractors. They're an eyesore." I couldn't help smiling. "They've been here longer than the subdivision." Her expression hardened. "That doesn't mean they'll stay." For a second, I thought she was joking. She wasn't. She closed her notebook with a sharp snap. "Our community has standards, Mr. Carter. Property values are important." I glanced behind her at dozens of nearly identical houses, squeezed together, where cattle had grazed for decades. "My land isn't part of your HOA, so I've been told." There was something unsettling about the way she said it, not frustrated but determined. As she turned to leave, she looked back over her shoulder one last time. "We'll be speaking again." I watched her walk toward the subdivision entrance without another word. The breeze rustled through the cottonwood trees, but the peaceful feeling that had always settled over the farm was gone. For the first time since inheriting my family's land, I had the unmistakable feeling that someone wasn't simply unhappy with my property. They wanted control over it. Karen Whitmore wasn't bluffing. 3 days after our first conversation at the fence line, I found a white envelope tucked beneath the windshield wiper of my pickup truck. There wasn't a stamp, no mailing address, just my name written across the front in neat block letters. Inside was a formal-looking letter, printed on expensive stationery, with the Silver Ridge Estates logo embossed across the top. The first sentence actually made me laugh. "Notice of property violation." I read it twice, convinced someone had to be playing a joke. According to the letter, I had 10 days to remove unsightly agricultural machinery, repaint my weathered barn, replace my livestock fencing with decorative fencing that matched subdivision standards, and cease operation of heavy industrial equipment between the hours of 8 in the morning and 6 in the evening. Industrial equipment? I looked toward my grandfather's tractor sitting beside the workshop. It hadn't moved in 2 weeks. The only thing making noise that morning was my impact wrench. I folded the letter, walked inside and tossed it into the kitchen junk drawer. I figured that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The following Saturday, I was replacing hydraulic hoses on an old case tractor when a white golf cart rolled slowly up my gravel driveway. Karen was driving. Beside her sat a man wearing a polo shirt embroidered with the HOA logo. Both climbed out without asking permission. Karen looked around with obvious disgust. I see you ignored our notice. I kept working. I ignored it because it doesn't apply to me. The man beside her cleared his throat. I'm Douglas Pierce, chair of the Architectural Compliance Committee. I looked up. The what? Our committee ensures neighboring properties maintain acceptable visual standards. I couldn't help smiling. My property's been here since your committee members were in diapers. Karen stepped closer. You are negatively affecting every homeowner in this subdivision. I tightened another hydraulic fitting before answering. Then they probably should have built somewhere other than next to a working farm. Her jaw tightened. This is no longer a working farm. It absolutely is. I haven't seen crops. I restore agricultural equipment. That's a hobby. No. It's my business. She glanced toward my workshop, where 3 customer tractors waited for repairs. I doubt that. Almost on cue, an aging rancher named Bill Henderson drove through my gate in a dusty Ford pickup. He climbed out smiling. Morning, Ethan. He handed me an envelope. Here's the balance for fixing my baler. Then he noticed Karen. Everything all right? Karen answered before I could. We're addressing code violations. Bill looked around. What violations? She pointed dramatically toward my grandfather's tractor. That equipment. Bill stared at it, then at her. You mean the tractor? Yes. Bill scratched his beard. My daddy bought parts from Ethan's granddad before I was born. Karen folded her arms. That's irrelevant. Bill chuckled. No, ma'am. It's history. Karen ignored him completely. If Mr. Carter refuses voluntary compliance, we'll pursue legal remedies. I finally stood up. Removing my work gloves, I looked directly into her eyes. What legal remedies? She smiled. We're exploring annexation. I frowned. Annexation? Douglas proudly nodded. If your property becomes incorporated into Silver Ridge Estates, HOA regulations will apply. I stared at both of them. You honestly believe you can force 60 acres of agricultural land into your HOA? Karen smiled again. The county has approved developments before. My land isn't part of your development. It could be. Something about the confidence in her voice bothered me. She wasn't guessing. She believed she had a path. Bill stepped closer. Folks, I think it's time you leave. Karen ignored him. Instead, she reached into her folder and handed me another document. This is your final courtesy notice. I looked down. Across the bottom in bold letters were the words, "Success to comply may result in law enforcement involvement." I laughed. You think the sheriff's office is going to arrest me for owning a tractor? You'll find out. She turned, climbed into the golf cart, and drove away without another word. Bill watched her disappear before shaking his head. I've lived here 70 years. I've never seen anybody that determined. Neither had I. Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated almost daily. The county received anonymous complaints claiming I was operating an unlicensed commercial junkyard. Animal control visited after someone reported neglected livestock. The fire marshal inspected my workshop because of an alleged hazardous fuel storage violation. Every inspector arrived expecting the worst. Every one of them left after finding nothing wrong. One afternoon, Deputy Ryan Mitchell even stopped by after receiving a complaint that I was operating dangerous machinery near children. He looked around my empty pasture and sighed. Mr. Carter, I know this is getting old. I nodded. It isn't you, is it? He hesitated just long enough to answer the question without saying a word. Before leaving, he quietly added, keep every letter, every complaint, every visit. Something tells me you're going to need a paper trail. That advice echoed in my head later that evening as I organized a growing stack of notices on my kitchen table. The complaints weren't random anymore. They were coordinated. Someone was investing a tremendous amount of time trying to make my life miserable. Then, just before sunset, I heard tires crunching across my driveway again. This time it wasn't a golf cart. It was a sheriff's office patrol SUV, and behind it, a heavy-duty county tow truck. The driver was already lowering the loading ramps. That's when I realized this fight had become far bigger and far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The tow truck's steel ramps slammed onto the gravel with a metallic crash that echoed across the pasture. For a split second, I honestly thought they were going to haul away my grandfather's tractor. Deputy Ryan Mitchell climbed out of his patrol SUV before the tow truck driver could take another step. Hold up, he called. Nobody touches anything until I verify the paperwork. The tow truck operator shrugged. I'm just following the dispatch order. Mitchell held out his hand. Let me see it. I watched the deputy read the paperwork. His eyebrows slowly pulled together. Then he read it again. Finally, he looked over at me. Mr. Carter, have you ever been issued a county citation regarding this tractor? No. Any notice from the Department of Transportation? No. Any court order? Nothing. He sighed. I didn't think so. Karen's white SUV rolled into my driveway just then as though she'd been waiting nearby. She climbed out wearing oversized sunglasses and a smile that practically screamed victory. I assume you're here to enforce the law. Deputy Mitchell didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked straight toward her. Mrs. Whitmore, who submitted this complaint? I did. Based on what evidence? It's obvious. No, he replied calmly. It's not. She pointed dramatically toward the tractor. It has no registration. Mitchell held up the paperwork. This complaint says the tractor was being operated illegally on a public roadway. Karen nodded confidently. Correct. I folded my arms. That's impossible. She looked at me with a smug smile. Oh. It hasn't left this property in over 3 years. The deputy turned toward the tow truck driver. You can head out. The driver didn't argue. Within 2 minutes, the truck was backing down the driveway and disappearing through the front gate. Karen's smile vanished. What are you doing? Mitchell answered without raising his voice. Preventing an unlawful seizure. She looked stunned. But dispatch approved it. They approved responding to a complaint, not confiscating private property. Karen opened her mouth to argue again before Mitchell held up a hand. I'm done discussing it. He returned my paperwork, apologized for the inconvenience, and quietly added, You really should speak to an attorney. That conversation stayed with me all night. Until then, I'd been treating Karen like an annoying neighbor with too much free time. Now it felt different. Someone had filed official county documents containing statements that were demonstrably false. That wasn't neighborhood drama. That was something much more serious. The next morning, I drove into downtown Bozeman to meet someone Bill Henderson insisted I call. Her name was Rebecca Lawson. She was a 56-year-old property attorney whose office walls were lined with framed survey maps instead of expensive artwork. The moment I walked in carrying a cardboard box full of HOA notices, inspection reports, complaint records and photographs, she looked at me and smiled knowingly. You've been fighting this alone. I didn't think I needed a lawyer. She laughed softly. You'd be surprised how many clients say that. For nearly 2 hours she listened without interrupting. Every letter, every inspection, every conversation, every strange encounter. When I finished, she didn't immediately offer legal advice. Instead, she asked one question. Who built the subdivision? I blinked. What? The developer. I don't know. She leaned back in her chair. I do. She stood, walked to a filing cabinet, and pulled out a thick folder. Across the tab was printed, Silver Ridge Development Corporation. My stomach tightened. You've dealt with them before? Twice. Were they sued? Worse. She slid several public documents across her desk. One was a subdivision plat map. Another was a county zoning application. A third was an easement agreement. Rebecca circled something with her pen. Look here. I leaned closer. The southern boundary of my property was highlighted in yellow. It says, Agricultural Preservation Buffer, she finished. What does that mean? It means your property was intentionally excluded from the subdivision. Why? Because county approval required permanent agricultural land between the development and neighboring ranches. I frowned. So Karen can't force my property into the HOA. Rebecca smiled. Not legally. Relief washed over me until she added 5 words. But that's not the problem. She flipped to another document. This is. It was a set of HOA meeting minutes, obtained through a public records request. Most of it looked ordinary. Budget approvals, landscaping contracts, pool maintenance. Then one paragraph caught my eye. Rebecca tapped it with her finger. Read that aloud. I did. Future expansion discussions include acquisition or regulatory control of adjacent agricultural parcel for community enhancement. I looked up. They're talking about my land. They certainly are. But why? Rebecca reached for a county tax map and laid it beside the subdivision plans. Only then did I notice something I'd completely missed. The community walking trail ended abruptly, just 50 feet from my property line. Rebecca traced the unfinished path with her finger. If they controlled your land, they could extend the trail. And I studied the map. A creek crossed the center of my pasture before winding toward the subdivision. Then it hit me. The creek She nodded. The developer promised homeowners waterfront walking access in the original marketing brochures. But the creek is on my property. Exactly. I stared at the documents in disbelief. This was never about my tractor. Rebecca closed the folder. No. It was about making you so frustrated, so financially exhausted, that you'd either sell the land or agree to their terms. Silence filled the room. Then Rebecca opened one final envelope she had requested from the county recorder's office that morning. Inside was a signed internal memo from Silver Ridge Development Corporation. She handed it to me without saying a word. My eyes locked onto one sentence highlighted in yellow. Pressure on Carter should continue until voluntary acquisition becomes economically favorable. I looked up at Rebecca. She wasn't smiling anymore. They never wanted compliance, she said quietly. They wanted your farm. I read the memo 3 more times before I finally set it back on Rebecca Lawson's desk. Each time the words felt heavier. Pressure on Carter should continue until voluntary acquisition becomes economically favorable. There it was. Not speculation. Not a rumor. Not something a neighbor claimed to overhear. It was a written strategy. Someone had actually put into an official company memo that their plan was to pressure me until I gave up my family's land. I looked at Rebecca. Can they really do this? She folded her hands. They can try. And this, I tapped the memo. It proves intent. Intent to harass? Intent to interfere with your property rights. She leaned forward. The HOA has spent months pretending these complaints were about neighborhood standards. This document destroys that argument. It shows the real objective was to force you into selling. For the first time since Karen had appeared at my fence, I felt something besides frustration. Hope. Not because the fight was over, because I finally understood what I was fighting. Rebecca immediately went to work. She filed public records requests for every complaint submitted against my property, every email between the HOA board and Silver Ridge Development Corporation, every county inspection request, every communication involving my address. Within a week, the documents began arriving, and every new page made the situation worse for Karen. There were emails between HOA board members celebrating each inspection. Another message suggested, keep documenting every tractor movement. Eventually the county will find something. One board member even wrote, the legal fees alone will make Carter reconsider keeping the farm. Rebecca spread the emails across her conference table. They weren't enforcing rules. They were running a campaign. I shook my head. How could they think nobody would ever see this? People get careless when they believe they're untouchable. She was right. Karen had become so convinced she controlled everything that she'd stopped hiding it. That afternoon, Rebecca filed a civil lawsuit against Karen Whitmore personally, the entire HOA board, and Silver Ridge Development Corporation. The claims included harassment, abuse of process, tortious interference with business relationships, defamation, and conspiracy to interfere with protected agricultural property. By the next morning, word had spread through both the subdivision and the surrounding ranches. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Some neighbors apologized for believing the rumors. Others admitted they'd always suspected something wasn't right. Then something unexpected happened. 3 former HOA board members contacted Rebecca independently. Each wanted to talk. Each requested confidentiality. The first was a retired accountant named Linda Foster. She arrived carrying a banker's box filled with old meeting binders. I resigned last year, she explained. I thought the board was becoming reckless. Rebecca asked gently, why didn't you speak up sooner? Linda looked down. Because Karen threatened to sue anyone who released HOA records. She opened one of the binders. Inside were handwritten meeting notes. One entry immediately caught my attention. Karen's handwriting was unmistakable. Continue code enforcement until Carter becomes cooperative. Another note read, negative publicity may reduce his bargaining position. Rebecca carefully photographed every page. This is excellent evidence, Linda nodded. I figured it belonged with someone who'd actually use it. 2 days later, another former board member arrived. Then another. Each brought more emails, more meeting notes, more proof. By the end of the week, Rebecca's evidence room looked like an archive. Boxes lined the walls. Color-coded folders covered every conference table. A giant timeline stretched across one wall, with strings connecting complaints, inspections, emails, and board meetings. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Every anonymous complaint matched an HOA discussion just days earlier. Nothing had been random. Everything had been coordinated. Karen had built an entire strategy around making my life unbearable. She just hadn't expected anyone to connect the dots. But Karen wasn't finished. Not even close. 3 nights before our first court hearing, I woke around 2:15 a.m. to the frantic barking of my border collie Scout. He never barked without a reason. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The motion lights illuminated my equipment yard. At first, everything looked normal. Then I noticed it. The side door of my workshop stood partially open. I'd locked it before bed. My pulse quickened. I reached for my phone and dialed 911 while keeping my eyes fixed on the building. Within minutes, Deputy Ryan Mitchell arrived with 2 additional deputies. They cleared the workshop room by room. No one was inside. But someone had definitely been there. Cabinets had been opened. File drawers pulled out. My business records were scattered across the floor. Most disturbing of all, the folder containing copies of Rebecca's evidence was missing. Mitchell examined the damaged lock. This wasn't kids. No. This was targeted. He walked outside and studied the gravel driveway with his flashlight. Fresh tire tracks led toward the county road. Then another deputy called out, "Ryan, you've got to see this." We walked behind the workshop. Parked beside the fence was a black luxury SUV, empty. No license plate. But its engine was still warm. Mitchell shined his flashlight through the windshield. On the passenger seat sat a leather portfolio. Inside was a single document, a draft purchase agreement. At the top, in bold letters, were the words, "Offer to purchase, Carter Family Farm." The proposed sale price was less than half of the property's appraised value. Tucked behind it was a handwritten sticky note, just 6 words. "Court changes everything. Sell now." Deputy Mitchell looked at me, then at the document. His expression hardened. "This isn't intimidation anymore." He carefully sealed the papers into an evidence bag. "This," he said quietly, "is starting to look like criminal conduct." And for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized the courtroom wasn't just going to decide who owned my land. It might also decide who was going to jail. By 8:30 Monday morning, the Gallatin County Courthouse looked more like the scene of a high-profile criminal trial than a civil property dispute. Every seat inside Courtroom 3 was filled. Local ranchers sat shoulder to shoulder with homeowners from Silver Ridge Estates. Several county officials occupied the back row. Even a few reporters had shown up, after hearing rumors that the lawsuit involved alleged abuse of government resources, fraudulent complaints, and an HOA accused of trying to seize control of protected agricultural land. I adjusted my tie as Rebecca Lawson organized 3 thick trial binders on our table. She noticed me staring at the packed gallery. "Nervous?" I managed a smile. "I restore tractors. I've never testified in front of a courtroom full of strangers." She closed the final binder. "Good." I looked at her. "Good. It means you understand what's at stake." Across the aisle, Karen Whitmore entered with 2 attorneys from one of the largest firms in Bozeman. Gone was the confident smile she'd worn for months. She avoided looking in my direction. Instead, she whispered urgently to her legal team while flipping through stacks of documents. A few seats behind her sat Douglas Pierce and the remaining HOA board members. None of them looked comfortable. At exactly 9 o'clock, the courtroom doors closed. "Bailiff," a voice called. "All rise." Everyone stood as Judge Eleanor Brooks entered. She was known throughout Gallatin County for running an orderly courtroom and having very little patience for gamesmanship. She took her seat and adjusted her glasses. "Please be seated." The room settled into complete silence. Judge Brooks looked over the case file before speaking. "This matter concerns allegations of harassment, abuse of legal process, interference with business operations, fraudulent complaints to public agencies, conspiracy involving a homeowners association, and related civil claims." She looked directly at both legal teams. "I expect professionalism. If either side attempts theatrics instead of evidence, I will stop it immediately." Rebecca nodded. "So will we, Your Honor." Karen's lead attorney stood first. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about an HOA attempting to preserve neighborhood standards." Rebecca didn't even look up from her notes. The attorney continued. "Mrs. Whitmore acted in good faith, based upon repeated concerns expressed by homeowners." He described Karen as a volunteer, trying to improve the community. "A civic-minded resident, someone unfairly attacked for simply enforcing neighborhood expectations." When he finished, Karen actually smiled. Then Rebecca stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't pace dramatically. Instead, she walked slowly to the center of the courtroom. "This case," she began, "has absolutely nothing to do with neighborhood standards." She paused. "It is about power." She picked up my grandfather's faded photograph, showing the farmhouse in 1959. My client's family has owned this agricultural property for nearly 70 years. She placed the photograph on the evidence display. The defendants knew they had no legal authority over this land. She lifted another document, so they created pressure. Another document. False complaints. Another. Repeated government inspections. Another. Financial intimidation. She looked directly at the judge. And eventually, she held up the internal developer memo, a written plan to force the Carter family into selling. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. Karen shifted uneasily in her chair. Rebecca called me as her first witness. After being sworn in, I described my family's history, my restoration business, every inspection, every false complaint, and the day Deputy Mitchell stopped the unlawful attempt to tow my grandfather's tractor. Karen's attorney approached during cross-examination. Mr. Carter, you dislike the HOA, don't you? I dislike being harassed. Would you agree that farm equipment is unattractive to some people? I shrugged. Beauty isn't regulated by county ordinance. A few people in the gallery smiled. The attorney tried another angle. You intentionally refused to cooperate with the HOA. I refused to obey rules that didn't apply to my property. No further questions. Rebecca's next witness was Deputy Ryan Mitchell. He testified calmly and precisely. He explained each complaint, each inspection, each time county resources had been dispatched because of reports later proven false. Rebecca asked one simple question. Deputy, based on your experience, were these isolated complaints? No. What were they? He looked directly at the jury box before correcting himself with a glance toward the judge. It was a bench trial, not a jury trial. They appeared coordinated. Karen's attorney immediately stood. Objection. Speculation. Judge Brooks looked at Mitchell. Deputy, what is the basis for your opinion? Mitchell answered without hesitation. Because every complaint involved identical language, identical allegations, and originated shortly after HOA meetings. Overruled. Karen looked visibly shaken. Rebecca smiled slightly. Then she called Linda Foster. The former HOA board member carried the same banker's box she'd brought into Rebecca's office weeks earlier. She carefully removed the original handwritten meeting notes. Rebecca asked, "Do you recognize these documents?" "I do." "Who wrote them?" "Karen Whitmore." Karen's attorney jumped to his feet. Objection. Authentication. Rebecca calmly handed Linda another page. "Can you identify this handwriting?" Linda nodded. "I watched Mrs. Whitmore write these notes during board meetings for 3 years." Judge Brooks admitted the records into evidence. Karen's face turned pale, but Rebecca wasn't finished. She walked to the evidence cart and placed one final document beneath the courtroom camera. The internal memo from Silver Ridge Development Corporation appeared on the large courtroom monitor. Every person in the gallery leaned forward. Rebecca read the highlighted sentence aloud. Pressure on Carter should continue until voluntary acquisition becomes economically favorable. Silence. Absolute silence. Judge Brooks slowly lowered her reading glasses. She looked first at the memo, then at Karen, then at the developer's attorney. Finally, she asked one question that changed the atmosphere inside the courtroom. "Counsel, would either of you care to explain why this document exists?" No one answered. For nearly 10 seconds, the courtroom remained completely silent. Karen's attorney looked at the developer's attorney. The developer's attorney looked at Karen. Karen stared at the table in front of her. Judge Eleanor Brooks folded her hands. "I asked a very simple question. Still nothing." Finally, the developer's attorney stood. "Your Honor, that memorandum was an internal planning document taken out of context." Rebecca Lawson didn't even wait for him to finish. "Permission to approach." "Granted." Rebecca walked to the clerk's desk, carrying a second binder. She removed another document, then another, then a third. She handed each one to the judge. "Those are emails sent over a 14-month period." Judge Brooks silently reviewed the first page. Her eyebrows lifted. She turned another page, then another. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear someone shifting in the back row. Rebecca spoke calmly. "The memorandum wasn't taken out of context. It was company policy." She pointed toward the documents in the judge's hands. "Those emails repeatedly discuss increasing inspections, encouraging anonymous complaints, and making litigation expensive enough that my client would eventually surrender his family's farm." Judge Brooks looked over her glasses. "Counsel, did your clients authorize these communications?" Karen's attorney quietly cleared his throat. "We acknowledge the emails were sent." Rebecca didn't smile. She simply added one sentence. "So the conspiracy is no longer disputed." Karen closed her eyes. For the first time since this ordeal began, She looked frightened instead of angry. Then came the moment no one expected. Rebecca called her final witness. Your Honor, the plaintiff calls Mr. Thomas Grayson. The courtroom doors opened. A man in his early 60s walked to the witness stand. I recognized him immediately. He had been the original project manager for Silver Ridge Development before retiring 2 years earlier. After taking the oath, Rebecca asked only one question. Mr. Grayson, why are you here today? He looked directly at the judge. Because what happened to Mr. Carter never should have happened. The courtroom became perfectly still. Grayson explained that during the subdivision's planning stages, county officials required a permanent agricultural buffer between the development and neighboring ranches. That condition was non-negotiable. Without it, Silver Ridge would never have received approval. Rebecca asked, did the developer later attempt to remove that buffer? Repeatedly. Were those requests approved? No. What happened after they failed? Grayson took a deep breath. They shifted strategies. Karen's attorney immediately objected. Speculation. Grayson shook his head. I attended the meetings. The objection was overruled. Rebecca continued. What strategy? Grayson slowly turned toward Karen. The plan became making life so difficult for Mr. Carter that he'd eventually sell voluntarily. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Karen whispered something to her attorney. He simply stared at the table. Rebecca asked one final question. Who suggested using the HOA? Grayson answered without hesitation. Karen Whitmore. The courtroom exploded with whispers. Judge Brooks struck her gavel. Order! Order! When silence returned, she looked directly at Karen. Mrs. Whitmore, do you wish to testify? Karen stood. For months, she'd spoken with complete confidence. Now her voice barely carried across the courtroom. I only wanted to protect our neighborhood. Rebecca approached. Mrs. Whitmore, did you file complaints against Mr. Carter? Yes. Were some of those complaints false? I believe they were accurate. Rebecca handed her a photograph. It showed my tractor sitting inside my equipment shed on the exact day Karen claimed it had been driven on a public highway. The image contained a county-issued timestamp. Rebecca asked quietly, would you explain how this tractor was allegedly driving through town while simultaneously parked inside a locked building? Karen froze. Rebecca produced another exhibit. Security camera footage, another timestamp, another angle. The judge watched the video carefully. Then Karen's attorney leaned over and whispered something in her ear. Karen slowly lowered her head. I can't explain it. Rebecca nodded once. No further questions. Judge Brooks recessed for 45 minutes to review the evidence. Those 45 minutes felt longer than the previous 6 months combined. I stood near a courthouse window overlooking Main Street. Rebecca joined me. You've already won. I shook my head. The judge hasn't ruled. She smiled. The facts have. At exactly 2:15 p.m., the bailiff called everyone back into courtroom 3. Judge Brooks entered, carrying a stack of written findings nearly an inch thick. She looked at each party before speaking. This court has reviewed documentary evidence, witness testimony, electronic communications, public records, and contemporaneous meeting notes. She paused. The evidence establishes a deliberate and coordinated campaign to interfere with Mr. Carter's lawful use and enjoyment of his property. Karen closed her eyes. Judge Brooks continued. The defendants knowingly submitted false complaints to public agencies. They abused governmental resources. They interfered with an established business. They acted with malice. Then she looked directly at Karen Whitmore. Her next sentence made the entire courtroom go silent. This court finds the defendants jointly and severally liable. I felt my heart pounding against my ribs. Judge Brooks turned one final page. The court will now announce the remedies and sanctions. She adjusted her glasses. Every person in the courtroom leaned forward. And then she began reading the judgment. When people ask me today whether the fight was worth it, I don't even have to think about the answer. Absolutely. Not because of the court victory, not because of the financial judgment, and certainly not because the headlines eventually faded. It was worth it because my family's land is still exactly where my grandfather left it, surrounded by open pasture, weathered fences, and the same old red International harvester that somehow became the symbol of an entire legal battle. Every morning I still walk out onto the porch with a cup of coffee before sunrise. The horses still greet me at the fence. The cottonwood trees still sway in the Montana breeze. And every time I pass that tractor, I smile. Not because it reminds me of Karen, because it reminds me that some things are worth protecting. The lawsuit taught me a lesson I'll never forget. People who seek control often count on one thing, that you'll become too exhausted, too intimidated, or too overwhelmed to fight back. But facts don't disappear because someone is louder than you. Documents matter. Evidence matters. The truth matters. If you're facing an HOA, a neighbor, or anyone trying to bully you into giving up your rights, don't rely on rumors. Keep records, take photographs, save emails. Know your property boundaries, and most importantly, don't be afraid to ask for professional legal help before a small problem becomes a major one. If you've ever dealt with an HOA dispute, or simply had a neighbor who thought they could control property they didn't own, I would genuinely love to hear your story. What would you have done if someone had tried to call the sheriff over your tractor? Share your experience in the comments below. I read as many as I can, and some of your stories inspire future videos. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another true-to-life property rights drama, courtroom showdown, or HOA justice story. Thank you so much for watching, for spending your time here, and for supporting the channel. Until next time, remember, stand your ground, protect what's yours, and never let intimidation rewrite the truth.